The day she buried her father, her husband asked for a divorce. Not weeks later, not months, the very next morning, 6 months pregnant, standing in a funeral dress, she signed the papers without a single fight, no screaming, no begging. She just let him go. Everyone thought she had nothing left. He thought he was walking away clean. But what Marcus never knew, what nobody knew, was that the quiet janitor who raised her had spent 30 years hiding something so enormous, so carefully protected, that not even an army of lawyers could touch it. And the night he walked into that gala with his new wife on his arm, laughing like he'd won, he was about to walk straight into the biggest regret of his entire life. This story will remind you that the people who underestimate you are doing you the greatest favor of your life. Real power doesn't make noise, it just waits. If that kind of story speaks to you, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what you think she should have done differently, and make sure you subscribe, because we tell stories here that will stay with you long after they're over.
My knuckles were bone white, and I was just listening to that mechanical sound. There was a hiss and a beep, and the lights overhead just hummed along. I watched his chest move, up and down, but it wasn't him doing the work. "Daddy?" I whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the hospital on his skin. "I just need you to fight one more time." His hand was still warm in mine, calloused from a lifetime of work. It was strong enough to hold on, but not to wake up. The doctors, they were so gentle with their words, saying things like, "declining," but their soft language didn't change the truth. He was dying. I'd been in that room for 48 hours straight, no sleep, no food, just coffee that tasted bitter, and a back that ached from that awful chair. My husband, Marcus, had sent 2 texts. The first one asked if I needed anything. The second said he'd be late. I never answered. Outside, the world just kept going, you know? Cars honking, people laughing. No idea my own world was just stopping. But in that room, time felt thick and heavy, like it was trying to see how much I could take. My father raised me by himself. He never asked for anything, just gave me this steady, quiet love every single day. When I was 7, he taught me to tie my shoes. At 12, how to change a tire. At 16, he told me that the loudest people rarely have anything important to say. And when I was 23 and told him I was getting married, he didn't say he approved. He just watched Marcus over dinner. His questions felt a little too sharp back then. Afterwards, he hugged me and said, "I trust you to know what's in your own heart." He didn't say he trusted Marcus. He said he trusted me. I didn't understand the difference then, but it was all starting to make sense. A nurse slipped into the room, so quiet, checking his monitors. She wouldn't look at me. I suppose she'd seen this ending too many times. My phone buzzed, but I let it be, and then I saw his fingers move. I sat straight up, my heart just hammering. "Dad?" His lips moved, but nothing came out. I leaned closer, trying to catch a sound. He finally got out 3 words, each one a struggle. "Go to bank." And then the alarms started screaming. Nurses rushed in, gently leading me out into the hall. I just stood there, waiting for them to say what I already knew. My father was gone, and I had no idea what he meant. You know, growing up, I just assumed every dad worked 2 jobs, because mine did. I remember him coming home, looking so tired, but he always had a smile for me. I thought every father could fix a leaky pipe and tell the best bedtime stories. He was a janitor at the school during the day, and at night, he did maintenance at the church a few times a week. His weekends were for helping neighbors who couldn't afford repairs. They'd pay him with food and so much gratitude. He was never grumpy, just worked, came home, made dinner, and asked about my day like it was the most fascinating story in the world. We lived in a little 1-bedroom place. He gave me the bedroom and slept on the couch for 16 years. He never once made me feel like that was a burden. We didn't own much, but what we had was always spotless and cared for. He'd fold his work clothes with the same care other men gave their fancy suits. He shined his work boots every Sunday night. On our fridge calendar, every single one of my school events was circled in bright red. He never missed one. Other kids had parents in business suits with nice watches and new cars. My dad would show up in his janitor uniform, smelling faintly of cleaner, and he'd sit in the back so he wouldn't embarrass me. But I was never embarrassed, not for a second. While other parents were scrolling on their phones, my father watched me like I was the only person on that stage. He taught me things that, looking back, were odd for a janitor to know. He showed me how to read a contract, to find the tricky parts. He taught me to tell if someone was being dishonest by watching their hands, not their eyes. He explained how you could walk into a room and know who had the real influence. Money talks, baby girl, he'd say while we did dishes. But character whispers, and the people worth knowing listen for the whisper. I didn't get it then, but I never forgot. When my college acceptance letter came, he cried. Not sad tears, but these tears of pure pride that just lit up his whole face. You're going to do things I never could, he told me. You did everything, I said back. He just shook his head. No, I chose to do something different. There's a difference. I never asked him what he meant. I really wish I had. Because looking back now, I can see all the little pieces that never quite fit. The way he spoke, the books he kept, the fact that all the tellers at our bank knew him by his first name. My father wasn't just a janitor. He was a janitor for a reason. And I was about to find out what it was. It was pouring rain the day we buried him. Not a gentle, sad rain, but the angry kind that soaks you to the bone and turns the earth to muck. It felt like the sky itself was furious. I stood there by the grave, 6 months pregnant. Marcus was beside me, holding his own umbrella. I noticed that right away. Not because I wanted some grand gesture, but when the wind blew rain in my face, he didn't even flinch to shield me. He just stood there, staying dry, looking at his phone. One by one, people came up to hug me. They said all the things you're supposed to say. He's in a better place. At least he's not suffering. I just nodded and thanked them, letting them think it helped. What I wanted to scream was that the better place was here, with me. He was supposed to be here, to see me become a mother, to meet his grandbaby. Marcus checked his watch twice during the service. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share a memory, he stayed silent. I talked about my father's hands, how they were never still. Always fixing, always building, always steady when mine were trembling. My voice broke, and I had to stop. Marcus never reached out. When they lowered the casket, I stepped forward to put a rose on top, and my heels sank right into the mud. I nearly fell. An older woman from his church grabbed my elbow. "I've got you, honey," she whispered. Marcus never even saw it happen. Later, we all went to the church for sandwiches that I don't think anyone really ate. You know, I remember the coffee at your grandpa's funeral was awful, served in these flimsy paper cups that got cold right away. The sound of everyone talking felt so loud that day, I found a little spot away from it all and just sat, rubbing my belly. You were kicking up a storm in there, as if you already knew the world had turned upside down. It took Marcus a good 20 minutes to find me, and he didn't ask. He just told me, "I have to go out for a while." I looked at him, so confused, and asked, "Right now?" He said it was that work thing he'd mentioned, but I couldn't recall it at all. Maybe the sadness just erased it from my memory. It didn't seem to matter. "Okay," I whispered. He gave me a quick kiss on my head, one of those automatic ones that mean nothing. He said he'd see me that night, but he never came back. By 10 o'clock, I was just sitting in our apartment, still in my funeral clothes, staring at a phone that refused to ring. There were no messages, no calls at all, and no word from him. Just silence, and this terrible, cold feeling washing over me. I'd just buried the one man who was always there for me, and I was finally seeing that my own husband had left our marriage ages ago. I suppose I just hadn't wanted to see it until that night. The final proof didn't come from him or from a friend. It came from a picture on Instagram. It was almost midnight when I finally got up, changed out of that sad dress, washed my face, and got into bed. My whole body hurt from grief, but my brain just wouldn't quit. On autopilot, I picked up my phone to scroll, just needing something to distract me from two awful truths. My dad was gone, and my husband wasn't home. That's when I saw it. A picture of Marcus at a restaurant I knew. A fancy place with low lights and candles. He was with a woman I'd never seen before. And believe me, this wasn't some client dinner. She was young, and looked like she spent a lot of time and money to look that perfect. She was leaning forward, laughing at something he'd just said, and he was leaned back, looking so relaxed, with a smile I hadn't seen on his face in months. The caption just said, "New beginnings," with little champagne and sparkle emojis. It had been posted only an hour earlier. I just stared at that photo until my vision blurred. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there, my heart pounding in my ears. My father had been in the ground for less than 12 hours, and my husband was out celebrating a fresh start. I clicked on her profile. Isabel Chun, a marketing person with 73,000 followers. Every photo was like an ad for a life I knew I'd never touch. Then I looked through his recent activity and saw it all. He'd been liking her posts for 3 months. The comments were a little too familiar. It was a pattern I'd been too trusting, or maybe just too tired, to notice. My hands started to shake, but it wasn't sadness anymore. It was something else, like my body was finally catching up to the betrayal. I went to the bathroom and held onto the sink, looking at myself in the mirror, pregnant, exhausted, and married to a man who couldn't even wait a single day after my father's funeral to take another woman out. I didn't scream or break anything. I didn't even call him. I just stood there, breathing deeply, feeling you stir inside me. After a minute, I went back to bed, put the phone down, and I waited. Marcus finally came home at 2:14 in the morning. I heard the lock turn. I heard his keys hit the counter and his footsteps down the hall. He didn't even peek into our room. He went straight to the guest bedroom. Right then, I knew it was over. What I didn't know was how much worse it was about to get. He waited until morning to talk to me. Not out of kindness, but because cowards like to do their dirty work in the daylight. I was in the kitchen, just staring into a coffee cup I wasn't going to drink. When he walked in, he looked so rested and fresh, like he'd rehearsed this. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't answer, just watched him, knowing what was coming next. He sat down and folded his hands on the table like it was a business meeting. "I think we both know this isn't working," he started. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my face like a stone. "I've been unhappy for a while, and I think you have been too," he said. "We just didn't want to face it." A bitter laugh almost escaped me. "We." He said it as if I was part of the decision. "I want a divorce." The words were just flat. No sadness, no regret. I felt you kick hard, as if even you knew. "You're serious," I said, my voice steady. "I am. My father died 2 days ago." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry, but that doesn't change where we are." "Where we are." He made our whole life sound like a wrong turn on a map. "I'll support the baby financially," he went on, his voice all business. "I won't walk away from my responsibility. But us, we're done. I've met someone." And that was that. I just looked at him. I really saw him for the first time. This was the man I'd built a life with, the one who made all those promises, and there he sat, calmly dismantling my world like it was a pile of paperwork. "I've already talked to a lawyer," he said. "I'll have the papers drawn up by the end of the week. All you'll have to do is sign." "Just sign," I repeated, my voice hollow. "Yeah, I'm trying to make this as easy on you as possible." Easy. I wanted to scream, to throw something. I wanted to ask him how he could be so cruel, but I didn't, because something your grandpa always told me popped into my head. When someone shows you their true colors, believe them. And Marcus was showing me exactly who he was. And I believed him. "Okay," I said. He looked so surprised, like he'd been expecting a huge fight. "Okay, if that's what you want, then okay." He stood up, and you could just see the relief on his face. "I really think this is for the best." I didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving me there, 6 months pregnant and completely on my own. It was in that quiet moment I remembered your grandpa's very last words to me: "Go to the bank." So I grabbed my coat and walked right out the door. Now, some people might think there's a good reason to leave someone at their lowest, but what happened next would make you rethink everything you know about loyalty. The bank wasn't your average bank. It felt more like a fortress for secrets. I walked across this huge marble lobby with giant chandeliers that seemed way too fancy for a place that handled regular money. My sneakers made little squeaking noises on the perfectly polished floor. I felt so out of place, like I wasn't dressed for whatever was about to happen. A woman in a very sharp suit came up to me before I even reached a desk. "Miss Richardson?" I froze. "Yes?" "We've been expecting you. Please, follow me." I hadn't called, hadn't made an appointment, but somehow they were waiting. She led me behind the counter, through a heavy door she opened with a key card, and down a hallway that was completely silent. We went into a small room with no windows. A man who looked to be in his 60s, with kind eyes and gray hair, stood up. He had a calm way about him. "Miss Richardson," he said softly, "my name is Victor Kane. I was your father's account manager for 32 years. I am so very sorry for your loss." I just nodded, a lump growing in my throat. "He told me to come here, right before well, I couldn't even say the words back then. The man, Victor, just motioned for me to sit. He said your grandfather knew I would come, that he'd made very careful plans. Then he set this little metal box on the table between us, with the numbers 1247 carved into it. He explained it needed 2 keys. He had one, pulled right from his coat. The other, he said, should have been with my father's things. I remember reaching into my bag and finding that big envelope from the hospital. Inside was his wedding ring, that old watch, and a little brass key that had seemed like nothing until that very second. I handed it over, and he slid both keys in and turned them together. There was this perfect, solid click. He opened the box, then told me he'd give me some privacy to take my time. He was so quiet when he left the room, and I just sat there, staring at that open box. On the very top was a thick stack of papers, all held together with a simple black clip, and right there, an envelope with my name on it, in his familiar handwriting. But what was underneath all that? It just took my breath away. It was a pile of old photos. In one of them, there he was, your grandfather, looking about 25. He was standing in front of this incredible mansion, wearing a suit fancier than anything I'd ever seen him in. He was with a group of people who just looked like they ran the world. I turned to the next thing, a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline was something like, "Hartwell heir vanishes after family spat." I looked at the date, from 34 years ago. The name underneath the headline was James Hartwell III. I glanced back at that photo. It was him, no doubt about it. But that wasn't his name. My hands started to tremble as I reached for the documents. The very first page was a legal trust set up 28 years ago and changed just 3 weeks before he passed. The beneficiary was listed as Maya Richardson, me, and the trustee, Victor Kane. I tried to make sense of all the legal jargon, words I barely recognized. I saw things like irrevocable and protected interest, and something about a spousal exclusion clause. Then, my eyes caught a number at the bottom of the third page. I had to read it over and over again because it felt impossible. My father, the man who'd scrubbed floors for 35 years, had left me something that just didn't compute. It wasn't a house or a little savings. It was an entire empire. With shaking hands, I finally opened the envelope. The letter inside was on plain paper, nothing fancy, just his neat script, slanted a little to the right like it always was when he wrote carefully. It started, "Baby girl, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And I'm so sorry I couldn't be the one to tell you this myself. But some truths are easier to handle when you've lived enough to understand why they matter. My name wasn't always James Richardson." He wrote, "I was born James Hartwell III, the heir to a family that valued legacy over love and control over character. My father built an empire, my grandfather expanded it, and my job was simply to carry it on. No options, no questions, no life of my own. Then, when I was 26, I met your mother. She worked in a little bookshop near the college. She always had her hair in one long braid and would read poetry during her lunch break. She made me laugh, a real deep laugh I never knew I was missing. She didn't give a thought to my family's name or their money. She just saw me, the real me. I wanted to marry her. My family said no. It wasn't that she wasn't good enough. It was that she wasn't part of their grand design. They wanted business mergers, strategic pairings that would play well in the financial reports. They gave me an ultimatum, he wrote. The family fortune, or the life I actually wanted. I chose her. I had to stop reading then, just for a moment, to wipe my eyes, and they made sure I paid for it. They cut me off, disowned me publicly, and scrubbed my name from every record like I never existed. So I changed my name and took jobs that didn't require a background check. I started from scratch with nothing but the woman I loved, and the belief that a good life is about meaning, not money. Your mother and I had 6 incredible years before we lost her when you were born, and I promise you, honey, those 6 years were the richest of my entire life. But here's the part they never figured out. The thing I did before I walked away for good. I didn't just leave the money. I rearranged it. I tucked it away behind so many layers of legal protection that their whole army of lawyers couldn't find it. I gave control to a man I trusted completely. And then I just waited. I didn't do it for revenge, his letter went on. I did it because I had a feeling that you might need it someday. The money grew quietly, managed by people who knew that real wealth isn't about fancy things. It's about safety. It's about having choices. This gives you the power to protect yourself from the kind of people I ran from. The ones who only see value in you if you're useful to them. I wanted you to grow up without any of that. I needed you to figure out who you were before you figured out what you had, to fall in love for the right reasons, to build your own character when no one was watching. And now that you know the truth, you have to understand this part. This isn't meant to change who you are. It's meant to give you the power to stay exactly who you are, without compromises, without fear, and without ever needing anyone's permission. I put the letter down then. It all made sense. He wasn't running from his fortune. He was protecting me from it, right up until the moment I'd need it the most. The rest of the papers laid it all out. The language was so cold and official. It was an irrevocable trust agreement, created just 6 months after he took on his new identity. It was updated every 5 years, with the last change made 3 weeks before he died, right after he got his diagnosis. I read it so carefully, making myself understand every word. This wasn't just money in a bank. It was a fortress, built with legal terms and a long-term plan. Every asset was inside other legal structures, making them impossible to get to through lawsuits or divorces or debt. My name wasn't on a single public record, no tax forms, no property titles, nothing. Victor Kane, the man who gave me the box, was the trustee. He had all the power to manage it, but he couldn't spend a dime without my written consent after my 25th birthday. I had turned 25 just 3 months before that day. One part, though, really made me stop. It was called a spousal exclusion clause. I had to read it twice to get what the legal words meant, and then it hit me. If I ever got married, my husband would have zero claim to any of it. The fortune was mine, only mine, forever. Looking back, I realize it wasn't a punishment or him being distrustful. It was the ultimate protection. He'd seen wealthy families torn apart by bad divorces. He built a wall around my future that nobody could ever breach. Not some charming schemer, not a con artist, not even a good husband in a marriage that simply didn't work out. A husband had no claim on the original money or on the income it made, not on any of it. The trust was only for me, designed to be safe from anyone who might try to use me to get to it. He wrote it that way because he knew, not about Marcus specifically, of course, but he knew someone like him might come along one day. A man with a great smile and a lot of promises, who would disappear when things got real. The trust was designed so I could have money whenever I needed it, but the moment I received it, it was my own separate property by law. Marcus could never touch it, not in a divorce, not ever. Your grandfather saw it coming. Maybe not the face or the name, but he knew the pattern. And he spent 30 years making sure no one could ever hurt me the way his own family tried to hurt him. There were other protections too, clauses for any future children, what to do if I ever couldn't make my own decisions, and even guidance on how to use the money if I wanted to. A certain phrase was repeated over and over in those papers. The beneficiary maintains sole and absolute discretion. In plain English, it meant it was all mine, to do whatever I wanted with. No one could ever tell me what to do with it. I could have invested it or given it all away, and no one would have ever had to know. My thoughts, of course, went straight to Marcus, to the divorce papers he said would be ready, acting like he was doing me some great kindness. It's almost funny, looking back on how completely clueless he was. He had no idea who my father truly was, or what I'd just inherited. He had no clue that the woman he was leaving behind now held more influence than he would ever see in his life. The question wasn't if I could retaliate, but if I even wanted to. Dad's advice kept playing in my mind, that real power is knowing you don't have to use it. But back then, I wasn't so sure. Power, I was learning, doesn't make a big scene. It's patient, and so I would be too. I picked up his letter again. 2 pages were left. Now that you know what you possessed, it read, you need to know something more important. Who you are. This money is not your identity. It never will be. You were built from other things, from principles, from sacrifice, from seeing what happens when a person puts love before an inheritance. He said he didn't raise me with nothing to punish me, but to teach me, so I would understand what it meant to earn something, to be patient, to live without, and to make choices based on what really matters, not just what's easy. So many people born with money never learn that. They confuse their bank account with their character. They think money makes them strong, when all it really does is make them loud. You are not like them, he wrote. You know that strength is not about what you possess. It's about what you do when you possess nothing at all. And now that I had everything, he said I needed to hold on to that lesson, because the truth would come out, eventually. Not right away, but one day. And on that day, I'd see everyone's true colors. The people who were with me when I had nothing would be with me when I had everything. The ones who abandoned me would try to come back, and those who misjudged me would suddenly want a second chance. Allow them, he wrote, not because I owed them anything, but because watching people reveal who they really are is one of the best educations you'll ever get. He said, some would be upset that I kept this a secret. Let them be. I didn't owe anyone a look at my finances or an excuse for my privacy. Some would expect me to change, to become arrogant or careless. He told me to prove them wrong by staying exactly who I was. And then there were the ones who would completely misread me. They'd see my quietness and think it was weakness. They'd confuse my kindness with a lack of sense. They would assume that because I didn't show off my wealth, I had nothing worth showing. Those are the ones to watch out for, he warned, not because they could hurt me financially, but because they would challenge my very character. My response to them would define the person I would become. So this was his true gift to me. Patience, the strength to sit with discomfort and not react, to let people believe whatever they wanted while I built something they could never touch, to stay silent when the world expected me to scream. Getting even is simple, he wrote. Any fool with money can ruin someone. But self-control, the choice not to use your power, that's special. That's a real legacy. I love you, my baby girl. I always have and I always will. You are going to be more than fine, Dad. I remember folding that letter so carefully and sliding it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I didn't call Marcus to tell him he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I just sat there with my hands on my belly, feeling you shift under my ribs, and I realized my father was right. Some fights aren't worth your energy, because the people who should lose are perfectly capable of destroying themselves all on their own. Victor came back about 20 minutes later. He tapped on the door so softly before coming in, giving me a moment to compose myself. "Do you have any questions?" he asked gently. I had just one. "How much is there?" He sat across from me and passed me a single piece of paper with a summary I could actually understand. It listed stocks, bonds, properties, private equity, and funds all over the world. The investments were spread across 12 different countries, all gathered cautiously over 34 years. They were managed with discretion, never with flash or recklessness. The total value, as of the last quarter, was $5.2 billion. The number just sat on the page, a fact my mind refused to process. I stared at it, read it again, and tried to connect it to the man who raised me in a tiny one-bedroom apartment and packed my lunches in old grocery bags. "That's impossible," I whispered. "That is a conservative estimate." Victor said, "Your father avoided high-risk ventures. He always chose stability over rapid growth. If he had been more daring, this number could have been substantially larger." A wave of dizziness washed over me. What am I supposed to do with it? Victor offered a sad but warm smile. "Anything you wish. That is the entire point. You could live on the interest and never spend the original amount. You could give it all to charity tomorrow. You could even act like it does not exist. It belongs to you without any conditions." "Does anybody else know about this?" I asked. "Only me, and now you. Your father was very careful about that." I thought of Marcus and the divorce he was pushing through, offering to help support the baby as if he were granting me a huge favor. He was completely unaware, and I had no intention of telling him. "I want to keep this private," I said with resolve. "No one else needs to know." Victor nodded his head. That is a very wise choice. Whenever you are ready, we can arrange for distributions. Until that time, everything will remain exactly as it is. I got up, shook his hand, and left the bank the same way I had arrived, alone, unsure, and grieving, but fundamentally changed. Because I now knew something Marcus did not. The woman he had discarded was not broken. She was fortified. And patience, just as my father had taught me, was the most formidable weapon a person could possess. About 3 weeks after that day, the courthouse photos appeared online. Marcus and Isabel, quickly and publicly married, smiling as if they had just won a prize. The comment section exploded almost instantly. Wow, that was fast. Did his wife not just lose her father? Some people have absolutely no shame. I saw the pictures and felt a sharp sting of pain, but I did not reply. I simply carried on with my life. I went to doctor's appointments, prepared the baby's nursery, and read my father's letter again and again. I must have committed every single word to memory. Whenever anyone asked how I was coping, I'd offer a gentle smile and give the same answer every single time. I am fine. And what was strange is that I truly was. It was not because the betrayal did not sting, but because I had learned a lesson that Marcus never would. True power does not need to perform for an audience. It simply bides its time. Think about it. Real strength remains quiet until it is absolutely necessary. Most people feel the need to broadcast their power the moment they get it. But those who have truly earned it know better. Marcus moved quickly. Our divorce was officially completed in just 43 days. His new marriage took place only 12 days after that. I signed every single document without putting up a fight. I requested no alimony. I did not contest the assets we did not really have. I took only what was legally hers, which was almost nothing, and allowed him to leave believing he had handled the whole situation with maturity. He made one public post about it, a very carefully written statement about moving on with grace and choosing his own happiness. The comments poured in, a mix of support and disgust. Good for you, man. Life is too short. You seriously could not wait 6 months? Her father literally just passed away. This is the exact reason people have lost faith in marriage. Isabel also posted something. It was a picture of her hand showing off a brand new ring. The caption read, "When you know, you just know." The internet certainly had its opinions, and they were very strong. I became the subject of stories people told at dinner parties. The pregnant wife, whose husband abandoned her, the woman who never uttered a single word in her own defense, the one everyone was watching, just waiting to see when she would finally crack. My husband had left me immediately following my father's funeral. The story was sympathetic, tragic, and a little bit pathetic. I heard it all from other people. Friends who were unsure of what to say, acquaintances who sent me awkward text messages, and complete strangers on the internet who argued over whether Marcus was a monster or just being honest about his feelings. I never corrected the gossip, never defended myself, or explained that I was doing just fine. In fact, I was doing better than fine. I just kept my head down, remembering another thing my dad taught me. Public opinion changes with the wind, but your character is forever. And Marcus? Well, he was showing his character to the world. I didn't have to say a thing. By the time I was 7 months pregnant, the noise died down. People find new things to talk about. My days were filled with building your crib, washing tiny clothes, and reading baby books that scared and excited me all at once. Victor would call once a week, just to check in and make sure I was all right. I always told him yes, even when things felt complicated. I wasn't having money trouble. Victor had quietly arranged for a monthly allowance that covered everything without anyone noticing. I was in such a fog back then, not really because of Marcus, but because of the silence. My dad was gone. My marriage was over, and the one person I thought could understand it all was a version of my father I'd never meet. The man he was 30 years before, facing the same impossible choice. Then, one Tuesday, a little piece of my future arrived in the mail. It was this lovely cream-colored envelope, heavy in my hand, with my name written in the most beautiful cursive and no return address. I opened it so carefully, and inside was an invitation. It said, "You are cordially invited to the inaugural event of the Richardson Hartwell Foundation." My heart just stopped. I had to read it again. Richardson Hartwell. That was my father's real name, which meant it was mine too. The event was for October 14th, a black tie thing at some private place. Very exclusive. And right at the bottom, in tiny letters, it said, "Your presence is requested as the Foundation's primary honoree." I had no idea what to make of it. Victor had never said a word about a foundation, and my dad's letter didn't mention it either. I grabbed my phone and called Victor. He answered right away. "You got the invitation?" he said, not even asking. "What is this all about?" I asked him. "It's your father's last project," he told me. "He worked on it for 2 years before he got sick. I've just been carrying out his wishes since he passed." "Time for what?" I remember asking. There was this little pause, and then he said, so gently, "It's time for everyone to know the real you." My heart started pounding. "I never agreed to any of this," I told him. "You don't have to do a thing you're not comfortable with," he promised. "But the event is happening, and all the guests have confirmed." "Who's on the list?" I asked. Another beat of silence. "Everyone who should be," he said. "And yes, that includes Marcus." 3 days later, it was official. A perfectly worded press release went out to all the local news stations and all the charity groups in the state. The Richardson Hartwell Foundation launches with a $50 million endowment. It read, "To support education, job training, and single-parent families." It said the first fundraising gala was next month, all to honor the legacy of a James Richardson who had spent over 3 decades serving his community in quiet, simple ways. There was a picture of my dad, but not in his work clothes. It was an old photo of him in a suit, looking like he belonged on Wall Street. You can imagine the confusion. People were saying, "Wait, isn't that the custodian from the elementary school? I never knew he had money. Where did this all come from?" The article didn't say. It just named Victor Kane as the director and had a list of board members nobody had ever heard of. It also talked about an anonymous donor whose incredible generosity made it all happen. The whole town was buzzing with a mix of curiosity and a healthy dose of doubt. $50 million doesn't just appear out of thin air. And James Richardson, the man who everyone knew fixed leaky faucets, just didn't fit the picture of a millionaire. The rumor mill went into overdrive. Some thought it was a scam. Others were convinced a celebrity was using my dad's good name for some scheme. A few even thought I'd gotten a huge settlement from Marcus and was trying to buy back my reputation. Not one person came close to the truth, probably because it was just too wild to even imagine. I just watched it all unfold from a distance. I didn't say a word, didn't correct anyone. Victor was managing everything, the press, the party planning, all of it. All I had to do was show up. But that guest list, it was a heavy weight on my mind. Victor sent it over in a secure email. There were 200 names, donors, community leaders, local politicians, and people my father had known for years. And there, near the very end of the list, was Marcus Chun and guest. My stomach just twisted into a knot. "Why is he invited?" I asked Victor over the phone. "Your father insisted," he said. "What?" He left incredibly detailed notes, down to the guest list. Marcus was on it. That's impossible, I said. Dad passed away before Marcus even left me. Your father was a very sharp man, Victor said, choosing his words so carefully. He had a gift for seeing how things would play out. I let that sink in, trying to wrap my head around it. My dad had known, maybe not the details, but he knew this was coming, and he made sure Marcus would be in that room when the truth came out. It wasn't for revenge. I see that now. It was for clarity. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered. You don't have to, Victor said gently. But if you don't, you'll always wonder what you missed. I thought about my dad's letter, about being patient and letting people reveal who they really are. He'll bring Isabel, I said, my voice barely there. Probably, Victor agreed. And people will stare. They're already staring, I replied. I took a deep breath and felt the baby kick, right under my hand. Okay, I finally said. I'll be there. Good, Victor replied. Because this night isn't about him. It's about you, and it's high time people understood the difference. And the venue? Oh, it was something else. An old mansion turned into this incredible event space, chandeliers that looked like they were made of frozen light hung from the ceilings, and the floors were so shiny you could see them reflected perfectly. The tablecloths probably cost more than my rent. I arrived a half hour early, and Victor met me at a private entrance. He took one look at me and just smiled. You look absolutely perfect, he said. I'd chosen my dress so carefully. It was this beautiful emerald green with a high waist, making room for my very obvious baby bump. I wore my hair up simply and had on almost no jewelry, except for one very special thing, a diamond necklace from the safety deposit box. It was old and elegant, a piece that didn't scream for attention unless you knew what you were seeing. I had no clue what it was worth, only that it belonged to my grandmother, the one my father's family had disowned along with him. Wearing it felt like taking back a piece of my history. How are you holding up? Victor asked. I'm scared to death, I admitted. Good, he said. That means you're alive to it. The guests started trickling in. I watched them from a little private room with a one-way window, looking out over the main hall. I saw so many familiar faces, people from my dad's church, old coworkers, neighbors, and then I saw him. Marcus walked in with Isabel on his arm. She was wearing this bright, look-at-me red dress, the kind of woman who expects every eye to be on her. Marcus, though, he just looked uncomfortable, and not because it was a fancy party. It was because he had no clue why he was there. I could see him scanning the room, looking for me, but he couldn't see me, of course. Isabel pulled him over to the bar, and they stood there with their drinks, smiling at strangers and pretending to be the perfect couple. I could feel my own heart beating in my ears. Suddenly, Victor was beside me. You don't have to go out yet, he said. We can wait for the program to begin. No, I said quietly. I want to walk in like everyone else. Are you sure? He asked. I just nodded. Because my father taught me something important. Confidence isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing it anyway. I left that little room, walked down a long hall, and just stood for a second at the entrance. I took one deep breath, and then I walked in. The room didn't go silent all at once. It was more like the whole energy just shifted. The happy chatter just slowly fizzled out. Conversations trailed off. Every single head turned. Not because I made a big scene, but because I was so very pregnant and so very alone. I could almost see the realization spreading from person to person. Marcus saw me. His face went completely blank, then it morphed into confusion, and then I saw a flicker of what looked like genuine panic. Isabel leaned in and whispered something to him, but he didn't even look at her. He just kept staring at me. I didn't give him a single glance. I just walked, calm as I could, to a reserved table near the stage, sat down carefully, and folded my hands in my lap. Just breathe. A woman I'd never met came over to me. She had a kind, older face. "You must be Maya," she said softly. "Your father talked about you all the time. I'm so very sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I managed to say. She gave me this warm smile. "He would be so incredibly proud of you tonight." A lump formed in my throat, and all I could do was nod. You know, so many people came up to me that night, sharing these wonderfully kind things about your grandfather. And the whole time, I could feel Marcus just frozen across the room. I think a thought was just starting to dawn on him, you see, that this wasn't just some charity event. This was my event, and he had no idea what was about to unfold. When the lights went down and Victor walked up to that microphone, well, that's when it all began. He started by thanking everyone, saying the night was about honoring a man who lived his values, especially when no one was watching. He talked about Dad's quiet kindness, and I could see people nodding, a few even dabbing their eyes. Then, Victor's voice shifted, and he said something that changed the air in the room. He told them that my father made a very hard choice. 34 years ago, he said, my father walked away from a life of incredible wealth, all because he wouldn't give up on love. He changed his name, started over with nothing, and built a life based on his own two hands, not what he was owed. You could hear little murmurs ripple through the crowd. I saw Marcus lean forward, really listening for the first time. Victor explained that the decision cost Dad everything his family valued, but that it gave him his integrity and, well, me, a daughter who got his principles instead of his money. Victor paused then, letting it all sink in. He explained that the foundation existed because Dad never forgot his roots, and because he spent 30 years making sure I could build something meaningful, without the baggage of entitlement. Then he turned toward me and said it was his honor to introduce the foundation's founder. And that was me, Maya Richardson. The applause started, a little polite at first, and then it just grew and grew. I remember walking to that stage, honey, and every single step felt a mile long. I watched Marcus's face as he put it all together. You could see the confusion melt into understanding, and then that understanding curdled into just absolute horror. He was finally connecting the dots. Richardson Hartwell. That was my father's real name, the $50 million endowment, all of it. It was mine. I saw Isabella look at him, completely lost, but he didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring at the woman he'd left, 6 months pregnant and grieving, a woman he thought was broken. But she was now on a stage, and he finally saw what I was. Not a victim, but a legacy. I got to the mic, and the whole room went silent. I didn't look at him, though. I looked out at all the people who truly loved my father. And then I began to speak. My voice was calm, not loud, just clear. I told them my father taught me that the biggest choices we make are the ones no one ever sees. I remember pausing, thinking of him. He taught me that love isn't about what's easy. It's about showing up when it's hard, when you have every reason in the world to walk away. I saw a few heads nod. I also said that he taught me wealth without character is just noise, and real power is what you do when nobody's making you do a thing. I glanced at my notes, took a breath, and reminded them all that they knew my father as a janitor, a man who was always there and never asked for anything. Then I looked up and told them what they didn't know, that he was born into one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. He was supposed to take over an empire, I explained, but he walked away because the people in that world told him love wasn't a good investment. You should have heard the gasps then. But his voice was strong in my head when I said, he proved them wrong. He spent 34 years showing that a good life is measured by your integrity, not your bank account. And when he died, he left me something better than money. I stopped for a moment then. He left me a choice. The room was so still, you could hear a pin drop. I told them I could have kept it all a secret, just disappeared with what he built for me, and no one would have ever known. But my father didn't hide his wealth out of shame. He hid it because he wanted me to know who I was, long before I ever knew what I had. I let that sit with them for a second, and now that I knew both, I was going to do what he would have done. I was going to build something that mattered. I told them I would help the people who get overlooked and support families who don't have anyone else. Victor came and put a document on the podium beside me. He announced that the Richardson Hartwell Foundation was starting with a gift of $50 million and was set up to grow for generations. The applause started to swell, but I held up a hand. I told them that $50 million was less than 1% of the trust my father had set up for me. The clapping just stopped. Everyone was looking at each other, trying to do the math. I told them the last valuation was $5.2 billion. It was completely silent then. It wasn't shock, sweetheart. It was understanding. I wasn't smiling. It was just a fact. I said, I wasn't telling them this to show off, but to make it clear that my father didn't raise me to be rich. He raised me to be responsible. And that was exactly what I was going to be. After I stepped away from the microphone, the applause was deafening. It was a roar. People were on their feet. Some were even crying. I walked off that stage, feeling calm, and went back to my seat. Across the room, Marcus hadn't moved. His face was white as a sheet, his hands gripping the table. I could see Isabella trying to talk to him, but he wasn't there. He was just doing the math. The woman he'd left with nothing had just revealed she controlled more wealth than he could dream of. And he hadn't left me because I wasn't enough. He'd left because he never once thought to ask who I truly was. You know, if you ever find yourself underestimating someone because they're quiet, just remember that night. It's funny, the story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but Marcus was already trying to find the exit the second I left that stage. You know, I remember seeing him stand up and grab her hand. Something about needing air. But your Uncle Victor was faster, in his own quiet way. He didn't block Marcus, just stood by the door with this calm smile that said everything without making a sound. Marcus just froze. Poor Isabel looked so lost. He couldn't answer her, could he? What could he say? That the woman he'd left 8 weeks before, pregnant and grieving, was now one of the wealthiest people in the state? That he'd given up billions because he couldn't handle the hard parts? He just sat back down, a puppet with its strings cut, all around us. The room was buzzing with celebration, with talk about the foundation and your grandpa's incredible story. I overheard someone nearby say, "Imagine walking away from that, all for love." Another person added, "And raising a daughter that grounded? That's the real treasure." Every word was a little sting, a reminder of the man he chose not to be. I glanced his way once. He was watching me, surrounded by people, congratulating me, but I didn't look back. It wasn't about being mean, honey. It was just, he wasn't my story anymore. Then I saw Isabel finally connect the dots. "That's your ex-wife?" she whispered to him. He just nodded. "The one you said had nothing?" He was silent. She pulled her hand away, ever so slightly. I could see it even from across the room. She was reevaluating everything. She wasn't mad, not yet. She was calculating, wondering if she'd hitched her wagon to a man who could get things so wrong. I saw the look on her face, and it was a strange feeling, like looking in a mirror. That must have been how I looked to him, when he reevaluated my worth based on what he thought I'd lost. He suddenly stood up. I need to talk to her. Isabel tried to stop him, but he was already walking toward me. Your Uncle Victor met him halfway, always the gentleman. She's not available right now, he said. I just need 5 minutes. She's not interested, Victor replied. Marcus's jaw got tight. You can't speak for her. I don't have to, Victor said calmly. She asked me to make sure you understood there's nothing left to say. That was it. The door was closed, and he just stood there, completely useless, while I spoke with people who actually mattered to our future. He probably wanted some big scene, an explanation, maybe even absolution. But I didn't owe him that. About 10 minutes later, I slipped out a side door. No grand exit. I was just gone. And as I left, I think he finally understood what it felt like to be completely irrelevant. You, my darling Naomi Grace Richardson, you arrived on a Thursday. You were 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair, and you had your grandfather's eyes. I held you for the first time in that quiet hospital room. There was no husband in the hall, no big family waiting, just Victor, who insisted on being there, and a sweet nurse named Petra. Petra stayed hours after her shift ended, bless her heart. She said no one should welcome a baby into the world alone. She's just perfect, she whispered. All I could do was nod, tears streaming down my face. Your grandpa should have been there, sweetheart. He should have held you and seen the beautiful life his sacrifice had protected. Holding you felt like holding his promise. I looked at your perfect little face and knew my purpose. I will always protect you, I whispered. But your grandpa was gone, and I had to be enough for both of us. I memorized every tiny line on your fingers. He loved you long before you were here, I told you. He made sure you would have a life that was safe and full of choices. And you just let out a tiny, perfect yawn. James would have been bursting with pride, Victor said, his voice so gentle. You did a good thing, Maya. I remember letting out a long breath. I feel like all I did was survive. He just smiled and said, That's more than most people can say. I spent 2 more days there, learning how to be your mom, running on 2 hours of sleep. A bouquet arrived from Marcus. The card was simple. Congratulations, wishing you both well. I threw them away. It wasn't anger, honey, it was just, they were meaningless. An empty gesture from a man who had chosen to be a stranger. Around that time, Isabel posted a picture of them at brunch. Smiling, the caption said, Choosing joy every day. I didn't even read the comments. I had more important things to focus on. When I brought you home, the whole apartment felt different. It was smaller, quieter, but so full of you. I put your bassinet right next to my bed, and above it, I hung the mobile your grandfather had made. He carved those little wooden animals himself on nights he couldn't sleep. I found them in his apartment, all wrapped up with a note. For when she arrives. Those little animals spun over you, making soft shadows on the wall. I sat in the rocking chair, held you close, and sang a lullaby he used to sing to me. For the first time since he'd passed, I felt something like peace. The grief was still there, but I was finally learning his lesson. A legacy isn't about what you leave for people, it's about the people you leave behind. The foundation grew so fast it surprised everyone. In just 6 months, we'd funded scholarships for 40 students. We opened a new job training center and partnered with 3 nonprofits that helped single parents with emergency aid. I did it all quietly, no big press events or fancy parties. I just showed up, made the decisions that mattered, signed the checks that could change a life, and then I came home to you. People started to recognize me, not like a celebrity, but as someone who was making a difference. I'll never forget, a woman in her late 30s stopped me in the grocery store with tears in her eyes. You paid for my son's tuition, she said, her voice shaking. He's the first person in our family to ever go to college. It's because of you. I gave her a small smile. It's because of your son, I told her. He's the one who did the work. No, she insisted, shaking her head. It's because someone believed he was worth it. Thank you. Moments like that happened more and more. I saved every letter, every email. On the hard days, I would read them and remember that it all mattered. Your grandpa was right. Money without purpose is just noise. But wealth, used with intention, that's how you build something that lasts. By the time you blew out the candle on your first birthday cake, the foundation was working in 3 different counties. Victor ran the daily operations, and I just tried to guide the vision. You know, honey, it's funny how quickly people stopped wondering where the foundation's money came from. They were just glad it was there. I'd hear things about your father, Marcus, from time to time. He even tried to send a check once, Fizian, for $5,000, right to the main office. Victor sent it straight back. There was no note, just the check with a single word written on it. Declined. He never tried again after that. As for Isabel, she left him about 14 months after that big party. It wasn't messy, just sensible. I think she finally understood what I'd always known. He was the kind of man who would always be looking for an upgrade, only to realize his mistake later. She was too smart to be the next person he completely misjudged. Our divorce went through so quietly, I doubt many people even knew it happened. In the end, Marcus became exactly what I figured he would: unimportant. I never set out to ruin him. I just built a new life for us, and he simply wasn't in it. That made him a minor character in a story that was never really his to begin with. He only saw you once, and it was by chance. We were in a park near his office building. You must have been about 18 months old, chattering at the birds. I think I looked different then, stronger and more comfortable in my own skin. For a second, I thought he might come over, but Victor was with us. He was walking right beside you, laughing at something you'd said, present in a way your father never was. So he just watched us from afar. You had my smile and your grandfather's eyes. You looked so happy and so loved. I can only imagine what a strange feeling that must have been for him to see. Not quite jealousy, but the slow realization of what he'd thrown away. He could have been the one pushing that stroller, the one hearing his daughter laugh. He could have built a life with real meaning, but he chose the easier path. He thought I was too much effort, so he looked for a life that was simple and convenient. What he got was a life that was empty. Isabel was long gone, and his career had quietly stalled. The world he thought he was trading up for just felt hollow. In that same time, I had built something real and solid, not with a big show of revenge. I just did it with quiet, steady work. The foundation kept growing, and my name started appearing on education panels and community boards. I never went looking for any recognition, but it found me. I suppose people will always value someone who gets things done, and I just kept getting things done. Your father, on the other hand, was stuck. His career was flat, his relationships were shallow. His whole life seemed like a performance he was putting on for an empty theater. Sometimes I wonder if he ever considered reaching out, to apologize or explain. But what could he say? Sorry I wasn't strong enough for the hard parts? Sorry I didn't see your worth? None of it would have changed a thing. I had moved on, and he was left with a hard lesson learned far too late. The years just slipped by. You started kindergarten, the foundation hit its 5-year mark, and my name even appeared in a business journal. The article called me the philanthropist you've never heard of. It talked about Grandpa, the foundation, and all the work we were doing. It only mentioned Marcus once, saying I was previously married, but has been a single mother since her daughter's birth. Just one little sentence that turned him into a footnote. When I read it, I felt a strange sense of rightness, not because it was mean, but because it was true. He was a detail, a short phase I went through before my real life began. And the hardest part, for him, I imagine, was knowing he had earned that small place in my story. I went back to your grandfather's apartment one last time. 6 years had passed since he was gone. 6 years of building and growing and figuring out who I was without anyone telling me. You were with Victor that day, which gave me the quiet I needed to say my final goodbye to that place. The rooms felt so much smaller than I remembered. I ran my hand over the kitchen counter, where Dad had made countless meals, and sat on the floor, where his couch had been for 16 years, all so I could have the bedroom. The apartment was bare. Everything had been given away. All that was left were the memories and one last envelope he'd left for me. Victor held onto it until he knew the time was right. I opened it carefully. "Baby girl," it started. "If you're reading this, enough time has passed for you to understand. Loss is not a punishment. Loss is permission. It's permission to find out who you are and to build something that reflects your own heart." He taught me that I didn't need anyone's okay to leave a situation where I wasn't valued. Not out of spite, you see, but because my own life was waiting for me. He always said, and I remember this so clearly, that character isn't what you have in your hands. It's what you do when your hands are empty. People would sometimes whisper that I had it easy, that everything was handed to me. But your grandpa knew the truth, that having money without sense is just a stack of paper. He told me I had the sense long before I ever had a dime. He wasn't proud of my success, honey. He was proud that I never lost my kindness, that I stayed true to myself. That, he said, was my true inheritance. I can still picture his handwriting as I put the letter away one final time. Then I walked out into that bright sunshine. Your mom, Naomi, was waiting for me at Victor's, and she just flew into my arms the moment I got there. I held on so tight. I asked her, "Did you have a good day?" And she told me they got ice cream. I looked over at Victor and smiled. He just gave me this little shrug and a grin, saying, "What can I say? Grandpa privileges." The three of us went to the car, and Naomi was just chattering away about everything, with Victor asking her the silliest things to make her laugh. As I was buckling her in, I looked at this little person who would never know her granddad. But I knew she would be filled with his spirit, and right then, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in ages. I was just so thankful, not for what I was given, but for the woman I was finally free to be. Your grandpa was right about everything. You know, losing him wasn't an ending for me. It was a new start. It was the moment I finally gave myself permission to be exactly who I wanted to be, without asking if it was okay. And I think I made the right choices. It's funny how certain stories can make you think about things like loyalty and patience. Isn't it? They do more than just pass the time. They help you grow. I've always believed that you shouldn't just watch life, you should learn from it. I remember that day so clearly, and I wanted to tell you about it because it was so important. It reminds me of how some moments don't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes, if you look closely, you'll see another one is just about to begin, and you won't want to miss a thing. I'm so glad I could share this with you. And I hope you always stay curious and keep listening for the stories that speak to your own heart. I tell you all this because our family stories were put together with such care, passed down to teach us something important. Each memory is crafted to inspire us and make us stronger. I've always believed that the best stories can change a person, and I'm committed to sharing the ones that matter with you. Thank you for listening, my dear. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.